Earlier this year, a humanist group set out to silence a group of government officials in Carroll County, Maryland, from praying in Jesus' name. They did this by demanding that the federal government step in with hefty fines if this group continued to pray in Jesus' name. On the 26th of March of this year, federal judge William Quarles Jr. ruled that the Carroll County Board of Commissioners must cease opening its meetings with Christian prayers offered in Jesus' name while the lawsuit over these sectarian prayers proceeded. Now, many Christians would have been quick to submit themselves to this legal decree, but not Robin Bartlett Frazier. As a matter of fact, the day after the judge made his ruling for them to stop praying in Jesus' name until they could have the court case, Carroll County Commissioner Robin Bartlett Frazier told her fellow board members that she was willing to go to jail in order to continue praying in Jesus' name. She was willing to go to jail rather than to obey the unconstitutional federal decree. Commissioner Frazier also appealed to our country's Declaration of Independence by declaring, if we cease to believe our rights came from God, we cease to be America. In this way, Robin Bartlett Frazier reminds us that America's independence is very dependent on God. Here in our study this morning, we're going to spend our time examining the basis for our country's independence. And as we make our way through our study today, we're going to learn, first of all, that America's independence is dependent upon God's determined design. Secondly, this morning we'll learn that America's independence is dependent upon God's divine dispensation. Thirdly and finally today we'll learn that America's independence is dependent upon God's dedicated disciples. With this as our outline, let's open our Bibles to Acts chapter 17. And as you make your way to Acts chapter 17, I want to take a moment to read a portion of the Declaration of Independence, which our country's Congress officially adopted on July 4th, 1776. You're probably familiar with it, but here's what it says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. As we consider this portion of our Declaration of Independence, I want to first point out that the founding fathers of our great nation were declaring their independence not from God. They weren't saying, okay, let's form a government which is based on separation of church and state, and the state is going to do, secular things, and the church can go off and do their own thing. And no, that's not what's being said here. Our founding fathers were not declaring independence from God. They were declaring their independence from the dictatorial, tyrannical rule of oppression that came from Great Britain. They were declaring independence from King George. At the same time, these men also believed that our nation's independence was entirely dependent upon God's design. In order to prove my point, I should remind you that the Declaration of Independence clearly states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, it only stands to reason that if these men believed that we're all created equal, then they must have also believed in a creator God who had designed them to be created in this specific way. They were referring to the creator when they referred to us as being created equal. The evidence of their faith can be seen in the fact that 50% of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 50% of them were seminary graduates. And according to one historian's research, 51 out of the 56 signers strongly embraced a Christian worldview. 50% of them seminary graduates, 51 out of the 56 Christians. To further prove this point, that our founding fathers were depending upon the divine design of our Creator, I want to consider the testimony of these men who signed the Declaration of Independence. For example, Robert Treat Paine was one signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was representing Massachusetts. And it was in his last will and testament when this faith-filled man declared this. He said, "I am constrained to express my adoration of the Supreme Being, the author of my existence, in full belief of his providential goodness and his forgiving mercy revealed to the world through Jesus Christ, through whom I hope for never-ending happiness in a future state." He believed in the God of the Bible, and that the God of the Bible was the author of his existence. Roger Sherman, who was the only founding father to sign all 4 of our great state papers of the U.S., which include the Continental Association, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence, he once said this: "I believe that there is one only living and true God existing in 3 persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the same in substance, equal in power and glory, that the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments are a revelation from God and a complete rule to direct us how we may glorify and enjoy him." It sounds like he's preparing a dissertation for a seminary. Without debate, Roger Sherman, who signed all 4 of those state papers of the United States, he believed that the God of the Bible was the creator of mankind. Another signer of the Declaration of Independence named Richard Stockton, he once stated this: "I think it proper here not only to subscribe to the doctrines of the Christian religion, but also in the bowels of a father's affection to exhort and charge them," speaking of his children, "that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, that the way of life held up in the Christian system is calculated for the most complete happiness." Here is Richard Stockton saying that the Christian system, or the system of theology that defines Christianity, will bring us the most happiness. Now, when Stockton claims to subscribe to the doctrines of the Christian religion, he was obviously including the belief that we are divinely designed by the God that's found in the Bible. And as we consider these quotes here, as we consider the backgrounds and the beliefs of these men, there should be no doubt in our minds that they were basing our nation's independence from Great Britain upon a dependence upon God's design to not only create us, but then to provide true freedom for every person through the salvation that's found at the foot of Jesus' cross. Now, with this as our focus, I'd like to compare this to what Paul was saying here in Acts chapter 17. If you would look with me, beginning there at verse 24. There Paul declares, "God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Now, here in these verses, Paul is helping us to understand that God is the one who has created everything, and by his design, he's already determined the pre-appointed times and the boundaries of every nation. Now, at this point in time when Paul was writing this, America was not yet a nation. And yet, did God not know? Did he not pre-appoint the times and the boundaries of America? Well, of course he did. Paul says he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings. God had a pre-appointed plan for the creation of this nation, and it's by his design that a group of men decided to form a more perfect union here in this country. According to our founding fathers, or at least the lion's share of them, the creator of the world had his hand on our country's independence over Great Britain. For example, consider the words of Benjamin Franklin, who had some questionable theology, but he himself was not only a signer of the Declaration, but he also had a very interesting view about God's hand on the creation of our nation. He once declared this. He said, "It is the duty of mankind on all suitable occasions to acknowledge their dependence on the divine being." This man who declared independence from Great Britain was not declaring independence from God, but rather dependence on God. He's saying that we must, on all occasions, acknowledge our dependence on the divine being. And he goes on to say that Almighty God would mercifully interpose and still the rage of war among the nations, and that he would take this province under his protection, confound the designs, and defeat the attempts of its enemies, and unite our hearts and strengthen our hands in every undertaking that may be for the public good and for our defense and security in this time of danger. Or more simply put, Benjamin Franklin was encouraging every American to seek the providential protection of God. And the reason why is because God was the one who was providing them with the power that they needed to defeat Great Britain. Saying we need to seek God for protection from Great Britain and their military. And in this, he was saying, in order to gain our independence from Great Britain, we need to be dependent upon the God of the Bible. In similar fashion, another man with questionable theology, Thomas Jefferson, he not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he's credited for establishing the so-called separation of church and state, which has drastically been distorted from its original intention. But he once declared this. He said, "God who gave us life gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." Now, in light of all of this, there should be no doubt in our minds that the founding fathers of our country not only believed in the God of the Bible who created all things, but they also believed that our nation's liberation, which allows us to pursue the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are completely dependent upon the sovereign God who has determined to grant us these freedoms. They were saying that the freedom and the rights that we have here in this country are by the design of the God of the Bible, who created us and allowed us to come and establish this nation. It's for this reason that Commissioner Fraser from Maryland, well, she was correct when she declared that if we cease to believe our rights came from God, we cease to be America. If we cease to believe that our rights came from God, we cease to be America. Or more simply put, Commissioner Fraser was attempting to remind us that our country's independence from tyranny, it came from our dependence upon God's determined design to bless those who will simply submit to his sovereign rule. She's saying if we forget that God is the one who designed this country to be a great nation, if we forget that our nation is great because of his grace, then we will cease to be America. What she was also saying is that the further we find ourselves straying from that determined design of God, is the closer we come to finding ourselves returning to the tyranny of the wicked. This is exactly what founding father Patrick Henry was warning us about when he declared, "It is when people forget God that tyrants forge their chains." When people forget God, dictators begin to rise up. That being the case, we must remind the people here in America that our independence is not independence from God. Our independence is based on a dependency. It's based on God's determined design that we depend upon, so that we can maintain our independence from wicked tyrants. And the further we get away from this truth, is the closer the Christians in our country will come to being persecuted, just like the believers who are being persecuted in countries that are ruled by communism, or those countries where the rulers are Islamic. Not only that, but listen, we must also help others understand that America's independence is completely dependent upon God's divine dispensation. And in order to explain what I mean by that, if you would, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 1. As you make your way to Ephesians 1, it'll help us to understand that the times that the Lord has already determined, the pre-appointed times and boundaries of our nation, well, it all falls within a greater dispensation. And it's important to point out just real briefly that the Bible can be divided up into several theological dispensations, and we don't have time to get into all of that this morning. But currently we find ourselves living in what's called the dispensation of grace, which began with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit upon the day of Pentecost. And it's during this dispensation of grace that the Lord has been dispensing his grace to Jew and Gentile alike. In other words, he's been dispensing this grace to the Jews who will believe and everyone else who will simply believe in Jesus. And this seems to be what Paul was writing about here in this letter that he wrote to the Christians in Ephesus. But this is our focus. Look with me there at Ephesians chapter 1. I want to begin reading at verse 7. Paul here declares, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace, which he made to abound toward us in all wisdom and prudence, having made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in himself, that in the dispensation of the fullness of the times he might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth in him." Now here in these verses we find Paul, he's writing about this dispensation that we find ourselves in, and it's this time period when God is dispensing his grace to those who will repent and trust in the finished work of Jesus Christ. And according to Paul, this dispensation of grace, which we also refer to as the church age, it's the period of time when God has determined to dispense the riches of his grace upon those who will simply receive this forgiveness of sins through faith in the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And according to our founding fathers, this dispensation of grace is actually the basis for our country's independence. This dispensation of grace that's found in a relationship with Jesus Christ, it's the foundation of our country's independence. In order to prove my point, we should consider the words of our sixth president, John Quincy Adams. It was actually July 4th, 1837, some 61 years after the Declaration of Independence was first issued. It was then when President Adams explained how our country's independence was entirely dependent upon this dispensation of grace. Listen to how President Adams put it when he declared, "In the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation," speaking of America, "the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior. It forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation." The Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission on earth and laid the cornerstone of human government on the first precepts of Christianity. Wow. I don't know about you, but that gives me cold chills. As we consider the way that our sixth president is saying, look, the birth of our Savior has dispensed this grace through his ongoing mission, through his disciples. And this is directly linked to the birth of our nation, which is a continuation of the dispensation of this grace. What this means is that our sixth president of the United States believed that our nation's independence from Great Britain and the birth of our nation had everything to do with the furthering of the dispensation of the gospel of grace, so that people might come here and learn about Jesus and be saved. In order to further prove my point, I want to remind you that the opening paragraph of our nation's Declaration of Independence states this again: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Here we see that the founding fathers of our country not only believed in a creator God who has determined our design, but they also believed that this creator has endowed us with these certain unalienable rights. Or in other words, these men recognized that the Lord was enabling them to create a more perfect union here in America so that the grace of God could be freely dispensed to all men here in the land of the free. In this way, America's independence from Great Britain was entirely dependent upon the divine dispensation of God, who was deciding to allow this nation, America, to be formed so that his grace could continue to be dispensed through the preaching of the gospel. In order to further prove my point, consider the words of the Declaration signer named Samuel Adams. He's more known for beer now, but originally he was a founding father who signed our Declaration of Independence. And Adams recommended a study of the scriptures in order to understand the basis of America's struggle against a tyrannical king by declaring this. He said, "The rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament." He didn't direct people to the catechism. He didn't direct people to the decrees of King George or the Church of England. He didn't direct people to the institutes of the Anglican Church. he encouraged people to read the New Testament, where they would find the basis for the rights of the colonists as Christians. The unalienable rights that God has provided for us here in this country are based on the first principles that are found within the New Testament. That's what Samuel Adams was saying. This man who came to be known as the father of the American Revolution was claiming that the inspiration for seeking to separate themselves from the rule of Britain's ungodly monarchy came from the New Testament scriptures, which clearly defines these unalienable rights that our Creator has endowed us with. Another man named Samuel Chase, he not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he also went on to become an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He also described the way in which the Lord's dispensation of grace had become the foundation of our national freedoms by declaring this. He says, by our form of government, the Christian religion is the established religion, and all sects and denominations of Christians are placed upon the same equal footing and are equally entitled to protection in their religious liberty. More simply put, Chase was telling us that the dispensation of grace, which created the conditions for our national independence, not only freed us from the political tyranny of Great Britain, but it also freed us from the religious tyranny of the Church of England, as well as the Catholic Church. People could come over here and become a part of a Christian denomination that they enjoyed. They didn't have to join the Church of England, or they didn't have to join the Catholic Church. They could be free to worship God in the denomination of their choosing. And as a result, we're free to worship God according to His Word. We should also consider what Benjamin Franklin meant when he declared, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians. Not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. From this, Benjamin Franklin seems to be suggesting that the formation of our nation was actually a dispensation of grace which was based upon the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And it would seem as if Benjamin Franklin believed that the independence of America was actually an outpouring of grace which was provided to those believers who were looking for a place where they could come and freely worship God according to His Word. What this also suggests to us then is that the Lord, who previously determined to dispense His grace upon this nation, was also allowing the leaders of America to hand our unalienable rights. He was saying, hey, you no longer have to be a subject of these tyrants. And yet, at the same time, we still have the freedom here in this country to hand these rights back over to the tyranny of those who would rob us of these freedoms. God's saying, hey, I'm ready to pour this freedom out on you, but if you want to hand it back over to the tyrants, if you want to hand this back over to dictators, if you want to be ruled by ungodly people, you have that freedom too. It's sad to say that the political course that our country is currently on is bound to lead us straight into the bondage of those who don't submit themselves to the God who gave us the independence that we now enjoy. If we use our independence from Great Britain or from any other tyrant, if we use this independence improperly, then we're bound to hand our freedoms back over to someone who will be happy to take our freedoms from us. But this is our focus. If you would turn with me to Luke chapter 11. And as you make your way to Luke 11, I want to take a moment to consider the warnings that were presented by our nation's founding fathers, because they recognized this threat. The founding fathers of this country were concerned about the possibility that America might lose the independence that we enjoy. We might lose this freedom that the Lord has graciously given to us through the dispensation of His grace. And they were concerned that we might just end up back in the same state that they were in before they left Great Britain. For example, William Penn, who was the founder of Pennsylvania, he once declared, "If thou wouldest rule well, thou must rule for God. And to do that, thou must be ruled by him." He went on to say, "Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." Or more simply put, Penn was warning the leaders of our country that our nation is either going to be ruled by God or will be ruled by tyrants. It's one or the other. Either we're going to allow the Lord Jesus to be our king here in America, or someone else will take the place and will take that position and will lead us back into bondage. In similar fashion, President George Washington once declared, "It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible." Impossible, he says. In this way, our first president was assuring us that our leaders must seek the wisdom of God, which is found in his holy word, in order to continue enjoying the unalienable rights that were provided by the Lord according to his dispensation of grace. Daniel Webster, who not only served as a senator, but also as the Secretary of State, he once stated this: "If we abide by the principles taught in the Bible, our country will go on prospering and to prosper. But if we and our posterity neglect its instruction," remember the instruction of the Bible, "if we neglect its instruction and authority, no man can tell how sudden a catastrophe may overwhelm us and bury all our glory in profound obscurity." If our country neglects the instructions of Holy Scripture, then it won't be long before God sends in the Babylonians to bring us back under bondage. You see, our country's independence greatly depends upon our recognition of the principles that are clearly taught in the Bible. Noah Webster went on to tell us, and I should point out that Noah Webster was hailed as the father of public education here in America. He's the father of public education. Today, the educators believe that there's no place for the Scriptures in public schools. Not so back then. They believe that the Bible is crucial for raising Americans to understand the form of government that is founded here in this country. Noah Webster, as the father of public education, declares this: "In my view, the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. No truth is more evident to my mind than that the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people." Not only that, but he also went on to declare this: "If the citizens neglect their duty and place unprincipled men in office, the government will soon be corrupted. Laws will be made not for the public good so much as for the selfish or local purposes." In other words, America must be led by believers, or we will soon say goodbye to our unalienable rights. And we will soon say hello to the chains of slavery. Now, as we consider the warnings of these early American leaders, it's important for us to understand that we must elect leaders who recognize that our independence is completely dependent upon the dispensation of God's grace. And we must also understand that these leaders should first pledge their allegiance to the Lord before pledging their allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. You see, anybody can pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. But if they haven't yet pledged their allegiance to the Lord who dispensed his grace upon this nation 238 years ago, then they fail to even understand what the Pledge of Allegiance is all about. You see, those who don't submit themselves to the Lord won't be able to fully understand the source of the unalienable rights that God has given us. This is exactly what Jesus was saying here in Luke chapter 11. If you would look with me there at verse 23, there Jesus declared, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." There's no middle ground here. There's no gray area on this topic. You either stand with Jesus Christ and gather people to him through the dispensation of the gospel of grace, or you scatter against him. It's one or the other. And listen, it doesn't matter how conservative you are. You can be the most conservative, gun-toting, crop-growing American in the world. But if you are not standing with Jesus Christ and gathering people to his gospel, then you scatter against him. Period. As we consider what Jesus is saying, it's important for us to apply this truth to our modern politicians, because we're so quick to say, well, they're a Republican. It doesn't really matter what they believe. They're a conservative, so we can get behind them regardless of who they worship. Not according to Jesus. As we apply Luke 11:23 to modern politics, we must understand that our politicians are either standing with Jesus and gathering with him, or they are scattering against him. And listen, those who are scattering against the Lord Jesus will oftentimes attempt to lead our nation away from the grace that allowed our founding fathers to form a more perfect union, which has provided us with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, as we consider the large number of political leaders who are currently leading us away from the foundational beliefs of our founding fathers, it's important for us to remember that our form of government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. This brings us to our third point, because listen, America's independence is not only dependent upon God's determined design, and America's independence is not only dependent upon God's divine dispensation, but America's independence is also dependent upon God's dedicated disciples to continue maintaining this form of government. With this in mind, let's consider again the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It says this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Then it goes on to say this, that to secure these rights, in other words, if you want the security of these rights, it says governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's us. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, the ends of our unalienable rights, the minute our government begins to destroy these rights, it is the right of the people. That's us. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, those rights that God has given us. Here in this opening paragraph of our Declaration of Independence, we find our founding fathers, they're carefully explaining that it is we, the people, who are responsible for maintaining a form of government that is based on the same principles which were intended to provide the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in order to further grasp the responsibilities that they were actually defining here in this declaration, I want to continue to consider the beliefs of our founding fathers. For example, Benjamin Rush, who not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he was also a physician who served as the Surgeon General in the Continental Army. He once insisted that the only means of establishing and perpetuating our republican forms of government is the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by means of the Bible. In other words, Benjamin Rush believed that the youth of America must be instructed in the principles of the Bible or in the doctrines of Holy Scripture in order for our country's government to continue to secure the unalienable rights that the Lord has given us. The reason why is because, listen, the youth of today are the political leaders of tomorrow. And when the youth of today are being taught that we're all big, accidents that just somehow by chance happened after billions of years of a lot of other accidents, there's no value of life now. When we're taught that homosexuality is just an alternative lifestyle that should be celebrated, when they're taught that our rights don't derive from God, what kind of policies do you think these people are going to set? What kind of government do you think we'll end up with? Listen, if Jesus is not the king of our country, someone's going to become that king. And if that someone is not bowing a knee to Jesus Christ, you better believe that they're going to implement whatever they think is right. Benjamin Rush understood that the youth of today are the leaders of tomorrow. Therefore, they need to be instructed in the doctrines of the Holy Bible. Is it any wonder why the Bible was pulled out of public schools? Is it any surprise why our kids are not allowed to pray? And you hear story after story of a kid coming to school and during, the free time when they're allowed to read anything. If a kid pulls out a Bible, there will be many teachers who say, oh, no, you can't bring a Bible to school. I personally own a Bible printed back in the 1800s. It was printed by the government for the use of public schools. It says so in the opening flap. Our government printed Bibles for use in public schools. Now, what has happened? That our government not only no longer prints Bibles for school, but you can't even bring a Bible to school without someone saying, oh, you're gonna get in trouble. Noah Webster echoed the same sentiment here when he declared, in my view, the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. Now, if the founding fathers are saying under a free government, children should be instructed, under a free government, children ought to be instructed in the Bible. And you can't instruct our kids in public schools according to the Bible. Do we have a free government? Clearly, we do not. What happened? Where did it change? Clearly, we no longer have a free government according to the founding fathers. Because kids can't even bring Bibles to school without getting in trouble. Noah Webster went on to say this, no truth is more evident to my mind than that the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people. The Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people. Stew on that for the rest of the day. And then consider, are we still a free people? John Jay, who was America's first Supreme Court justice. Now, remember, he's a Supreme Court justice who, in today's modern times, would be expected to enforce some separation of church and state. This first Supreme Court justice, John Jay, he declared this: "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." In other words, John Jay was encouraging Christians to make sure that we exercise our right to vote by electing Christian leaders who will continue to maintain the form of government which has provided us with that right to vote. Noah Webster also weighed in on John Jay's point by declaring this. He says, "When you become entitled to exercise the right of voting for public officers, let it be impressed on your mind that God commands you to choose for rulers just men who will rule in the fear of God. The preservation of a Republican government depends on the faithful discharge of this duty." He's going as far as saying God commands you to vote for Christian leaders because they truly fear God. Christian, listen, the founding fathers were correct to encourage us to become dedicated disciples of Jesus Christ who set out to elect Christian leaders for this country. And the reason why is due to the fact that unbelievers don't understand that our national independence from tyranny is completely dependent upon the God who poured out his grace upon those early American leaders who sought to establish a form of government which is founded upon the truths of God's holy word. And what this means is that Christians should be dedicated to electing those leaders who walk in the light of this truth. Now, in order to further explain my point, if you would turn with me to Ephesians chapter 5. And as you make your way to Ephesians 5, I want to point out that when Christians choose to elect political leaders who reject the general principles of Christianity, then we're going to end up electing leaders who fail to understand that our nation's independence is entirely dependent upon the Lord. When we elect leaders who do not bow a knee to the Lord Jesus Christ, then we are electing leaders who do not understand what our nation is built upon. And so how can they lead us into the future? How can they lead us according to God's will if they don't submit themselves to the God who poured out his grace upon this nation? It's for this reason that Christians need to become dedicated disciples who are letting their political party know that we will only vote for those leaders who are walking in the light of the Lord Jesus Christ. If every Christian would contact the leaders of their political parties and say, "Give me Christian leaders or I don't vote," I would think that they would start scrambling, looking for some good Christian leaders. But we've made so many little compromises for so long that they're willing to just give us anybody because we'll go vote for them. We need to become dedicated disciples who are ready to say, "I'm not voting for this person, even though they're part of my party." Where is our allegiance? To a political party or to the Lord Jesus Christ? Not only do we need to tell our leaders that we're only going to vote for Christian politicians, But we must also become dedicated disciples who are ready to expose those candidates who are still walking according to their own sinful desires. Now, with this as our focus, I want to consider what Paul wrote here in Ephesians chapter 5. If you would look with me, beginning at verse 6, there Paul declares, "Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, do not be partakers with them. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light." Now, here in these verses, we find Paul encouraging us to expose those who would attempt to deceive us with empty words. And while Paul knew nothing about American politics, he seems to have been writing about this very thing. He warned us about those who would deceive us with empty words. And while Paul is focusing on these spiritual leaders, we have to understand that that statement so directly applies to American politics that it's scary. Because election after election, we find ourselves watching this TV screen with these talking heads that are just telling us lie after lie after lie, just empty words. Our nation is plagued by candidates who are quick to tell us what we want to hear for the sake of gaining some office. And while it would be nice to simply believe their beautiful lies, Paul encouraged us to look past the lie and find out if there's untruth there, and if so, expose it. Have nothing to do with it, but rather expose it with the true light of the Lord. We need to expose the unfruitful works of darkness by shining the light of truth upon the false beliefs of those people who are deceiving us with their lies. And what this means is that we must become dedicated disciples who look beyond the empty promise. We have to look beyond the packaging and the slick advertising. And we have to ask, what does this person believe? What church do they attend? Oh, it's easy for a candidate to get up and say, "What's my favorite book?" "Oh, let's see, the Bible." Yeah, it sells well. But is it true? What does this person believe? What church do they attend? What is their testimony? We must examine the religious beliefs of those who would love to lead our nation. And the reason why is because if we elect unbelievers into these offices, they will lead us according to their beliefs, not according to their promises. Because they'll promise anything. They will lead us according to their beliefs. Therefore, we must set out to become dedicated disciples who are electing leaders, who are standing upon the general principles that made this nation great. You see, according to our second president and signer of the Declaration, John Adams, he said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. He's saying the basis and the foundation for our national independence stem from or are built upon the general principles or the baseline doctrines of the Christian faith. And with that being the case, we need to become disciples who are dedicated to electing Christian candidates who will maintain the form of government that the Lord blessed with his grace 238 years ago. In conclusion, I'll remind you then that America's independence is not independence from God. America's independence is completely dependent upon God's determined design. And America's independence is completely dependent upon God's divine dispensation. And America's independence is completely dependent upon God's dedicated disciples who will settle for nothing less than Christian candidates. In conclusion, I just want to point out that the only way for us to really embrace the truth of this study is to first submit ourselves to the independence that happens on an individual level, which also is dependent upon the grace of God. You see, we're all going to be slaves of someone. It's a fact. We're either going to be a slave of unrighteousness and a slave of Satan's kingdom, or we're going to be a slave of righteousness and a slave of the Lord. That's what Paul tells us in the book of Romans. We're all going to be the slave of righteousness or the slave of unrighteousness. And the Lord would have us to gain independence from unrighteousness by becoming dependent upon him for his grace. Therefore, if you want to become an American, a true American, who is walking according to the life and the liberty and the pursuit of happiness that our founding fathers intended for you to discover, then you have to become a Christian. As a matter of fact, Charles Carroll, who also signed the Declaration of Independence, he wrote this: "Oh, the mercy of my Redeemer, I rely for salvation and on his merits, not on the works that I have done in obedience to his precepts." And Benjamin Rush, who I've already quoted, he was also a signer who stated this: "My only hope of salvation is in the infinite, transcendent love of God manifested to the world by the death of his Son upon the cross. Nothing but his blood will wash away my sins. I rely exclusively upon it. Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly." Our founding fathers wanted us to experience true independence from our sinful nature. It is the big idea of America. And while we get to enjoy independence from tyrants at this point in time, there might come a day when our country finds itself under the control of some dictator. Maybe not. But I'm here to tell you that whatever state you're in and whatever country you live in and whatever the form of government is, we can experience true independence from our unrighteousness by simply submitting ourselves to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so in conclusion, I encourage you to celebrate this July 4th weekend by submitting yourself to the Lord Jesus Christ. If you're not a Christian, then I encourage you, follow in the footsteps of the majority of our founding fathers by repenting of your sins and trusting in Jesus Christ so that you can experience the life and the liberty and the happiness that the Lord wants to provide you with.